Hi, my name is Diogo Bolster. All my degrees are in mechanical engineering, but right now I work as an associate professor at the University of Notre Dame in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering and Earth Sciences. I live in Mishawaka, Indiana, but I was born and raised in Dublin, Ireland. So I went to University College Dublin, back home in Ireland, and I studied mechanical engineering. I've always had an inkling towards engineering as a child. My father always noticed that I loved things like physics and mathematics and those kind of things. And to be perfectly honest, for a long time I thought I'd study physics and mathematics at university. But at the time, my high school physics and mathematics teacher, he actually recommended that I do engineering instead because he thought I could learn all those things and actually get a job at the end of it. Jobs in Ireland at the time were rare. Unemployment was the highest you could imagine, and he recommended I do engineering instead. And that wasn't too difficult. I always remember thinking about it that, electrical and electronic engineering, I had a very hard time visualizing what's going on. Electrons flying around the place didn't make sense. Chemistry, while I didn't mind it too much, I didn't feel passionate about it. Similarly, knowing what molecules are doing always kind of confused me. Civil and environmental engineering at the time seemed too big and grand, and mechanical engineering, I just always loved dynamics and understanding how things come together and move and components. And mechanical engineering just made the most sense from that perspective. So after I graduated, I actually decided I didn't want to be an engineer for a while. And I worked with a friend of mine in a startup company. We created the first ice rink and winter wonderland in Ireland. It was an abysmal failure, collapsed completely, but to this day it's the most exciting job I've ever had. The two of us had no right to be doing what we were doing, but we fundraised, hundreds of thousands of euro. We managed to open and organize an event and do these things. It was unbelievable. It was a job experience like I've never had in my life, where I had responsibilities and work hours like I've never had since then. It also taught me at the time that, as exciting and fun as that was, I wasn't an entrepreneur at heart, and so I decided then that I would go back and try engineering, and I moved to England for a while, and I worked there. I worked for a large consulting firm, working as what they call a computational fluid dynamics engineer. So I was building mathematical models to study flows inside and around buildings, to design better ventilation systems. I got to work on some really exciting and cool projects, like, for example, the design of the airport. At the time, what was going to be the new airport in Beijing for the Olympics that they hosted there. I did some work on the design for the velodrome, also for those Olympics. But at the end of the day, I found working in a large corporation to be kind of unsatisfying, not as challenging as I would like, particularly from an intellectual perspective. And that's when I realized that I really, really missed the university environment and the ability to think about things and challenge myself and my mind in as many ways as I can. And that's when I decided I'd go back and do my PhD. So I'm a professor at the University of Notre Dame, which involves a lot of different things. I teach students here, obviously. I teach classes on groundwater hydrology. I used to teach a class on fluid mechanics. I teach graduate level classes on risk assessment, which involves probability and statistics, as well as on modeling how contaminants move in the natural environment. Along with that, there's also a great deal of research. Most of my research is in the field of environmental fluid dynamics and hydrology. Again, I try to develop mathematical models that describe how contaminants move. And that includes, most of my work has to do with subsurface water, so aquifers, things like that, but my PhD related to indoor air. I've done some work on the atmosphere, and most recently I've been working in streams and rivers. So yeah, as I mentioned, all my degrees were in mechanical engineering. I've always loved the environment, and I especially so my area of my PhD was fluid dynamics, and I've always loved flows. I just love as a child, I used to like sitting next to the river and just watching the river flow by, watching debris go down. I love the ocean. I love watching the clouds, the wind, all those things. I mean, I always like to, one of the things I love to tell my students about the natural environment and why environmental science and environmental engineering is so difficult is, you know, God is the engineer that created it all, but he wasn't kind enough to share the plans. So we have to figure it out and deduce it. And that's always been a fascinating puzzle to me. And one of the things about mechanical engineering is typically one of those disciplines where we design everything. We impose the things that are going on. We build those structures. Whereas I really wanted to work on problems where I tried to untangle and understand the real world. Now, where I did my PhD at UC San Diego, the environmental fluid dynamics group happened to sit in the mechanical engineering department. At many, many other universities, it might sit in a civil engineering department or in a blend between the two. So even though I got my degree in mechanical engineering, my PhD advisor was actually an applied mathematician. Then when I went and I worked in Spain, after I got my PhD, I worked in a geotechnical engineering department, working on subsurface problems and the likes, and my postdoc advisor was a theoretical physicist. So really there's a lot of breadth out there. And for me, that's one of the things is that don't ever treat your degree as the label that defines who you are. I'm now in civil and environmental engineering. I like working on environmental problems. My department also has earth sciences, so it's civil and environmental engineering and earth sciences, and I consider myself a member of every three of those groups. In many ways, actually, I think we're really, really lucky at Notre Dame that those three are in the same department. It's not unusual to find civil and environmental engineering in the same department. It's really rare to find earth sciences in the same department. And it's a blessing. I mean, it's really fortunate, and it's one of those things that if we continue and we do it right, I think we can truly become leaders in the world because we recognize the connections between those in a strong way. So in many ways, it was kind of just a natural progression and path that I ended up in the department that I ended up in. So, I was born and raised in Ireland, as I said. Diogo is not exactly the most Irish name. My mother is Portuguese. But, when you have an Irish father and a Portuguese mother, the probability of you being Catholic or baptized Catholic is about 100%. And so I was. And it's been, I mean, again, I think when I describe it compared to, for example, people here in the United States, my school was a Catholic school, right? But all schools were Catholic schools. It was no different. So it was just kind of a very natural part of life. And unlike what I see here in the United States, it was just integrated. I mean, I didn't have any friends. Well, when we lived in Germany, I had many friends who were Muslim or Protestant, which was between 4 and 12. But during my teenage years, every single one of us was Catholic. We all went to Mass together. We all did our things together. And so it was just kind of a very natural part of life. And it wasn't, to be honest, in some ways, that makes it easy, right? That doesn't really challenge you in a big way. And that's where it was interesting, because is when I left home, I'd say I probably wasn't very disciplined or good in my faith, and I kind of left and went away. And it wasn't until I met my wife, who she herself is not Catholic, but it was her deep love and passion of God that kind of rekindled me and got me excited to think about it again and to invest myself in it. That's a really interesting question. And the reason for that is that, as I said, right, I just grew up with these Catholic ideas, and they were just part of natural life. So in many ways, I believe yes, right? And I'll give you, this is going to sound like a weird tangent, but if you're patient with me, it might make sense. My father's a diplomat, right? And he was involved in a lot of peace brokering in Northern Ireland between Catholics and Protestants, right? And we often in Ireland, we credit the United States as really, really having helped a great deal in that peace process. And Bill Clinton in particular sent a delegation over that was very, very successful. And for all intents and purposes, we've had peace in Northern Ireland for a very long time. And similarly, they've been trying to do similar things in Israel, as you might know, between Israel and Palestine. And they tried to replicate the exact model that they used in Northern Ireland with that peace process. And my father, he wrote a memo where he explicitly said, it's never going to work there. It's never going to work there. And I used to tell him, why not? I mean, you need to be more optimistic. And he says, the reason it worked in Northern Ireland is as much as these people hated each other, and he said hated and despised each other, every Sunday they would go to church and they would hear, love your enemy, respect your brother, do this kind of thing. And he says, and it's an integral part of life. Like, so no matter how much you try to avoid it, if you're hearing this over and over again, it just permeates through what you do. And in many ways, I'd say that's kind of what I would say. I wouldn't say that my faith has actively driven me to want to do certain things, but I was very involved in my parish growing up. You know, you asked me before why I became an engineer. I was the technician for my parish. I used to set up the computers for the parish priests. Anytime anything broke, I was the guy who was called to fix it and do things like that. And so I just always had this sense of purpose, and that whatever it was you were going to do, you should try and contribute to the common good in some way, shape, or form. So I think it's just a natural. I think they're naturally coupled together, but I'd be lying to you if I said that I proactively think about it on a daily basis. In fact, I did a similar interview to this, was it a couple of years ago on a radio program where I told somebody that the reason I do what I do is because I love the mathematical models. I love studying the systems that I study. I love the natural environment. I love all these things. It's not because I'm driven by a need to do good. The fact that my work can help contribute to good is a wonderful added bonus, but it's not the thing that gets me up every single day. So this is always an interesting question as well, because it's one of those things that, you know, many of my colleagues challenge me, and they ask me all the time, it's like, how can you be a scientist or an engineer and, you know, be somebody of faith as well? And I guess the answer to that question is I don't get the question. I've never seen any of those things as ever being in conflict with one another. I've never seen an issue between those things. So again, I don't see them as tightly coupled or detached. They're just who I am. Maybe that's a slightly lazy answer. Maybe I need to do a little more, introspection. But it's just that, you know, both parts define who I am, and so they come together that way. So I don't see it as being a challenge. I don't see it as being a burden. I will say this. There are many, many times where in my office, if I've had a particularly stressful day or a difficult day, I go to the law chapel and I say a prayer, and that's wonderfully relaxing and wonderfully helpful. My colleagues who don't have faith probably don't have that ability to do things like that. But again, it's one of these things that just, it is who I am, and I don't see it as being in conflict in any way, shape, or form. I don't know if that's your question, or if I'm answering your question properly, but that's kind of the way those things are often perceived, right? Is that somehow science and religion have to be opposing to each other, and that, to be perfectly honest, has never made sense to me. I completely and utterly get people who doubt their faith. I'd be lying to you if I said that I had strong faith my entire life, or even if I'd have strong faith every single day that takes place. But the issues of being in an academic environment or being in an environment driven by science and engineering, somehow not agreeing with the principles of theology or religion, just have never ever made sense to me. I think they work perfectly well in harmony together. Just do it. I know that sounds, again, based on my previous answer, there's no conflict between it. I mean, it's who you are, be true to yourself, and just do it. To be perfectly honest, I also don't think you'll face, some people talk about challenges and adversity that you're going to face. I don't think you'll face as many as people think you will. If it's the thing that fuels you and gets you going, and you can contribute to the world and make it a better place, what's stopping you? I mean, the only thing that stops you is your drive, your passion, your ability, and your motivations. As long as you've got those, you're in good shape. Um, no, I'd say I was pretty lucky in that regard. I mean, to be perfectly honest, I'm a big believer in hearing all stories and everything you can. I mean, I'm very lucky. As I said, my father's a diplomat. My mother's Portuguese. I was born and raised in Ireland, but I've been exposed to most of the world. I mean, before, by the time I was 18, I had traveled to more countries than most people will travel to in their entire lifetime. So I think I've heard a lot of messages, and I've seen them. And the one thing I've noticed time and time again is, irrespective of your faith, irrespective of religion, and all these kind of things, there are common threads that go through absolutely everything. And it's very easy for us to see conflict. It's very easy for us to see disagreement and issues and arguments between places. But at the end of the day, every single one of us really wants the same thing, I believe, and all of us hear that message in our heart. And I think if you talk to people, if you listen and you pay attention and you do it, there's nothing but a joyful optimism that I see for the future. And that gets blurred sometimes. Those issues come together. But that's what I've heard most of my life, and that's what I experienced in secondary school as well as at university. And sometimes you'll hear two different messages, and they'll sound polar opposite to one another, polar opposite to one another. And then you can take those two people, sit them down at a table, and engage them in a conversation to talk about those things. And you'll very, very quickly realize that actually behind both of those messages, there's 95% agreement. It's only on the fringes and the edges that people are disagreeing. And what I've noticed in my life, whether it be as an engineer, as a husband, a father, a friend, a student, listen, pay attention to what people are saying. Really, really listen to the message behind the words that are sometimes said as well, because if you pay attention to those things, that's when you'll really, really learn what's going on.